Welcome to the Kentucky Banker Podcast.
Hello, I'm Ballard, Cassady, President and CEO of the Kentucky Bankers Association, and we are extremely fortunate today to have Alex Sanchez on the phone for our first Kentucky Banker Podcast. Alex is the Chief Executive Officer of the Florida Bankers Association, and I got to tell you, he's involved in much more than that in Florida. Way too much for us to go into today, but most importantly is that he's been front and center of late on the important issue of credit unions and how they're affecting the banking industry. As many of our listeners well know, the credit unions are reaching a point of a $1.5 trillion industry, and they still pay $0 in federal taxes. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Alex, thank you for being here, and it's good to be speaking with you today. Are you there?
Ballard, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ballard, for inviting me, and thank you for everything you do for our industry, Ballard. And we really appreciate your friendship and working alongside you for this great industry of ours. And I want to say hello to all the Kentucky bankers, and it's an honor to be on with you, Ballard.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I appreciate you taking the time because I know how busy you are. But let's dive into it here for just a second. You have spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. lately. Can you tell us a little bit in short about what was in the credit union bill that you took with you to work on?
Ballard, I rented an apartment in Washington and was up in the Capitol Monday through Friday, each and every day, from morning to early evening, lobbying a bill. And it's my understanding that this was the first time our industry has lobbied legislation actively, openly, and publicly. And the bill would have exempted 96% of the credit unions. It would have closed the loophole on their outdated tax loophole. As you mentioned, they pay zero in federal taxes, but also zero in state taxes, state corporate income taxes. This would have closed that outdated loophole for all credit unions above the $1 billion asset threshold. Number two, it would have exempted the billion-dollar credit unions that are single-employer credit unions. So those credit unions that are just serving an employee group would have been exempted from this. For instance, in Florida, one of our major supermarkets has a credit union that's over $1 billion, but they just service the employees of that supermarket. They would have been exempted. So we're looking at about 4% of all the credit unions above the billion. And we're looking at about 300 credit unions around the country, Ballard. And in 1994, Ballard, there were 14 credit unions in our country that were over $1 billion. Today, there's 326. And by 2030, that number could be 500-600 credit unions. And what does that mean, Ballard? That means, as you know, Ballard, the continuing mushrooming of these credit unions is taking the market share away in an unfair and unlevel playing field way from our community banks and more now from our regional banks as well. Because these mega credit unions now are not only competing against community banks, they're competing against some of our larger mid-sized banks as well.
Right.
And that's what our bill would have done, Ballard. And I know you have more questions, but that was the crux of what our proposed legislation would have accomplished.
Well, you know, Alex, we here in Kentucky, we're one of 2 or 3 states that has a huge pension problem, and in our last legislature, one of the things that we talked about was the tax revenue on state side, and we had a couple of credit unions purchase banks, community banks. And my point was that it's one thing if the federal government doesn't want to tax them, but now that the fact that the credit unions are buying some of our state chartered or even federally chartered community banks here in Kentucky, it's costing the state income as well. So now the states should be raising their head up and getting interested in this issue also.
That's correct. But one of the challenges, as you know, Ballard, that we have, this is a federal issue. First and foremost, Ballard, this is a federal issue, as you know. Why? Why is that? Well, if you win at the state level in Kentucky and we win here at the state level in Florida, it doesn't matter because they'll just flip their charters from a state chartered credit union to a federal, and they will avoid the taxes from our respective states.
Absolutely.
So that's why the answer is in Washington. Our country faces $1 trillion budgetary shortfall in this fiscal year. Our nation now has a $22 trillion national debt. What resonated with members of Congress, Ballard, was it is time to end this corporate welfare by these mega credit unions. Leave the mom and pops alone. We're not talking about those smaller credit unions, but these larger ones. It is time they start paying for the defense of this country, for the needs of our veterans, for the needs of our seniors, our schools, our children, which credit unions do not do because they pay no state and federal corporate income taxes.
Well, this let me ask Alex, because I know you've done a terrific job up there, and you spent several months up there doing it. How many congressional members were you able to talk to and speak with? And if you don't mind, could you tell us a little bit about what their general feedback was to you on this issue?
Sure, Ballard. We met with over 100 members of Congress and staffs, and no one threw us out of their office. Met with members on both sides of the aisle. Republicans generally speaking, Republicans do not like that the government, through its tax policy, is picking winners and losers in the economy. And Democrats do not like that corporate welfare is being given out to billion-dollar-plus financial institutions where CEOs are making incredible pay packages of $1 million or more, depending on the size of the billion-dollar-plus credit union. That really stirred the stomachs of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. And so our message was well received. Leave the mom and pops alone. We're just talking about the mega credit unions. And then also specifically, and I'm a military veteran, as you know, Ballard. The military credit unions hide behind the facade of that they're serving the men and women in the military. And while credit unions like Navy Federal, I appreciate their commercials during the World Series, during the Super Bowl, during major sports and news events that obviously they can afford to pay the highest rates possible for advertising. But the fact of the matter is, I pointed out to members of Congress, their CEOs and executives are making millions, and they don't support the defense of this country, even though they say their mission is to serve the men and women in the military. They don't even pay for their salaries. And so when you ask a member of Congress, Ballard, should a $115 billion financial institution like Navy Federal be tax exempt, the obvious answer is no. So what was the message that Congress got from me? To sum it all up, they said, Alex, come back when your industry is serious about lobbying a legislative bill to close their tax loophole.
What do they mean by that, Alex, when they say when your industry is serious?
Well, because our industry, from sea to shining sea, all banking associations, we have to lobby a legislative bill. Our industry has done a good job in preparing ourselves for this moment, for this time, in white papers, in hiring experts, in having task forces with bankers, countless task force meetings by many of us in the banking association world. We have prepared ourselves for now, but the time has come to lobby legislation. The only way we're going to change the law of the land is by proposing a new bill to change the law of the land. And that takes a bill to be lobbied in the hallways of Congress. And so the message I got from everyone was, liberal, conservative, Republican, or Democrat, Alex, you got a good message here. I get it. They're growing. We're picking winners and losers in the economy. We have CEOs who are enriching themselves by skewing the tax laws of our country. But when your industry is united and ready to lobby a bill, come back and see us.
And Alex, I would take it that means that we need to get the ABA and the ICBA to join together and get a bill introduced.
I think not only them, but all of us at the state level and every banking association needs to be involved, because they're a $1.5 trillion industry now doing outrageous things. When I'm pointing this out, Ballard, to members of Congress, where Golden One Credit Union is just paid $120 million to have the naming rights to the Sacramento Kings NBA new $1 billion arena in Sacramento, California. They were appalled, Ballard. They were appalled that a non-for-profit could do this, or that the Denver Post did a story on the largest credit union in Denver, and found that the CEO of that large credit union had a $11 million pay package. They were just incredibly appalled. And so they're hiding behind the non-for-profit facade while stating that they are a members-owned credit union. And I think the time has come, while they're making bigger loans and corporate loans and doing all sorts of services, and now buying our banks and removing those banks from the state and federal corporate tax rolls. I think many people realize the time has come to close that loophole on just 4% of the credit unions, Ballard.
Right.
4%. And that gave comfort to many in Congress that we weren't attacking or addressing 50% of the credit unions or 40%. We were addressing the loophole that's outdated and abusive, enjoyed by 4% of the credit unions.
Well, Alex, we've got about a minute left here, so let me get you to sum up, if you would. I mean, obviously, the Florida Bankers Association and you and a lot of our counterparts felt like it was important enough to move you and your family to Washington to get a feel for this, if nothing else. What do you think, if we don't, and it sounds like now's the time, if we don't take advantage of this opportunity, what do you think the future is? What do you think it holds for banking?
Ballard, look, some in our industry have told me, Alex, this is not the right time. And my response to them is, when is the right time? We may be too late. And as our community banks continue to disappear, no matter what size bank you are in our industry, big or small or mid-level, one recognizes that the political heart and soul of the banking industry lies in the community banker, who knows that member of Congress. Generally speaking, I think everyone would recognize that to be a true statement. And as we have less and less of our community bankers, and now as the community banking industry merges within itself, but now being bought by the credit unions, we better act if we are to help that sector of our industry. And as I wrote in Fox Business, in an op-ed on Fox Business last year, and I meant this, Ballard, that if we don't close this loophole in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, the only place you're going to see a community bank in 20 years is going to be at the Smithsonian Institute.
Well, you're 100% right, Alex. And listen, I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you've done. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time, and your family and everybody, and heading to Washington. And I appreciate your time today. It's been very eye-opening, and I think our listeners are going to learn a lot just by hearing what you had to say about your visit to Washington. So I want to thank you again for your efforts on our behalf.